Oh hi, I didn't see you there. Hi guys, welcome to this week's weekly book chat. This week we are discussing Grit by Angela Duckworth. Grit, as you've guessed it, is about grit. She argues in this book that grit is much more important than talent when it comes to achievement. And she defines grit as passion and perseverance over a long period of time, despite setbacks, despite plateaus, despite issues. So the first really interesting thing in this book I found is that we all have a talent bias. There was a study where people were played two pieces of music and they were told one was by a child prodigy and one was by a person who had just worked very hard at their craft. Nearly everyone on the study selected the piece of music played by the child prodigy as the better piece. It then turned out it was the same piece of music. So we have a talent bias. We tend to deify people that are high achievers and say, they're just born like that, it's God-given talent. We're kind of just giving ourselves an excuse for not becoming high achievers or not putting the work in it takes to get to that level. So I found that very interesting. She says that talent does matter and the rate at which we get better does matter. However, effort matters twice because talent times effort equals skill, and skill times effort equals achievement, which I found to be very interesting, and that does make a lot of sense. She gives examples of a lot of people as well, a lot of exceptional people, top people in their field who, when they started out, weren't actually that talented. They just stuck with it. So I do think that is the case. And although in the study it shows that a lot of people would always say that hard work matters more than talent, but then when it comes down to it, they would actually pick talent. I think ultimately, over a long period of time, the book goes a long way to showing that effort really does matter more than talent. It also has some crossover with Atomic Habits in that it shows that skill and the acquisition of skill isn't a linear process. It doesn't just go like this in an upward trend. You go up a bit, you plateau, you stagnate, you encounter issues, and you just stick with it, building that latent potential until you shoot up again, and then the process repeats. She talks about how there's 4 assets of grit: interest, practice, purpose and hope. So interest is quite self-explanatory. Obviously you need to be interested in whatever you're doing. You need to find it enjoyable to some degree. It has to appeal to you. Practice is the same. After you've come over that initial fun period at the start, you have to schedule in regular practice. You have to do it even if you don't feel like it. Purpose is an interesting one. So she gave an example of, say, if there was 3 bricklayers building a church. You spoke to the first one and you said, what are you doing? He said, I'm laying brick because I'm getting paid for it. The second one says, well, I'm laying brick because I'm pretty good at it and I enjoy it. And the third one says, I'm building the house of God. It's going to benefit the community. It's going to benefit people who believe in God. There are examples in the book of studies that show that, for example, firefighters who done the most overtime were people who enjoyed the job, but also people who felt like they had a purpose, people who felt like they had a higher calling. I find that quite interesting, that a lot of high achievers are people who ultimately feel that what they're doing doesn't just serve them, but it also serves the greater good, the community and the world at large. So I'd known that about, Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. Obviously I understood that they had a purpose, and obviously, having that higher calling helped them overcome obstacles, but I didn't really realise that it applied to many high achievers. But many of the people studied in the book did say that they felt like they had a higher calling and what they were doing didn't just benefit themselves, and that allowed them to overcome adversity, which isn't really something that I had thought about much. And the last one is hope, because hope is part of a growth mindset. It leads to positive self-talk, which leads to perseverance. So hope is a key factor, that people always believe that they can get better, that the situation will get better, even in despite of everything looking like that's not actually the case. So again, I hadn't really thought about that. And it reminded me of something I seen Chad Wright. He's a former Navy SEAL and an ultramarathon runner. He was saying that you have to be deliberate with your self-talk. He says, he'll be on ultramarathons and he'll say to someone, how you doing, when they're in the last however many miles, and the person say, not so good, and he's like, what are you doing? Like, no one feels good now. You have to be deliberate in your self-talk. You have to say, I do feel good, I am going to finish. And that kind of sounds a bit reductive and a bit self-explanatory, but I hadn't really thought about it like that. But I think ultimately there is value in that, because some situations are unavoidably difficult. You're going to feel bad regardless. You might as well make the most of that. You might as well tell yourself that you can handle it and that you're going to finish. I do think that ultimately those kind of things do make a difference. You can wallow in the difficulty, or you can tell yourself you have it in your locker to beat it. So this book discusses that, and I thought that was quite interesting. She hones in on practice, and she says that it's not just about the amount of hours you put in as well, it's about the type of practice you do. So the top achievers, the top 1%, the elite, they do much more focused, deliberate practice than your average player, athlete, academic, etc. So they, every practice they start with a stretch goal. So for example, they want to Say if you usually run 100 metres in 10 seconds, today you want to run it in 9.9. You want to get marginally better, but it's a stretch goal because it will stretch you. It's going to be difficult. So you will set that goal, you will work towards that, you will then seek feedback and constructive criticism. They say the high achievers crave constructive feedback, and then they will take that on board and go again next practice. And then once they've mastered that new move, once they've got that new time, the process starts all over again. So they have a lot more focused, deliberate practice than your average person. She also discusses the difference between deliberate practice and flow, and the argument of can you be in flow when you're in deliberate practice, but ultimately she comes to the conclusion that deliberate practice is for practice and flow tends to be when you're actually performing and in the game. But she does say that high achievers do more deliberate practice and achieve more flow than the average person. The bit I found most interesting in the book is how all of this applied to parenting. You know, is there a system for raising gritty kids? Is there a way to get the best out of your children while still being a loving, supporting parent? I found it really interesting because, well, there's a number of things. First of all, studies show that children that do an extracurricular activity for a year do much better for the rest of their lives. They get better exam results, they get better jobs, they're healthier, they live longer. And if they do it for 2 years, those numbers shoot up even higher. So I found that very, very interesting. But when you think about it, that actually makes so much sense. So she said, like, when they're doing an activity, they're not always going to feel like it. So sometimes they're going to have to go when they don't want to. They're going to have to show up and give their best when they don't want to. They develop qualities that serve them through later life. I thought that was so interesting. One thing she does say that's very important is you can't push too early with kids. They have to come to activities on their own. They have to develop an interest on their own. Take some constructive criticism early on. They can take some pushing, but not too much, because ultimately then intrinsic interest will kind of dissipate if they're pushed too hard. So I thought that was interesting. They have to come to it on their own. So Angela Duckworth, the author, actually has a rule in her house. She has 2 daughters. The rule in her house is everyone has to do hard things, and you can change your hard thing. You know, say for instance, I think her daughter played the cello but didn't like it, and eventually she moved on. She had one daughter who stuck to her first activity straight away. The second daughter, I think, had went through like 6 or 7. But the rule is you can't quit mid-season. You can't quit mid-block of lessons, you know, something like that. Whatever you're doing, you have to see it through to the end of the current period, then you can change. Because the rule is, it doesn't matter what you're doing, but you have to do hard things. So I found that very, very interesting, and that's an excellent practice that I will definitely apply with my own children. Always ruminating on ways to be a good parent and to raise exceptional children, even though we have no intention of having children anytime soon. But I've always got my eyes and ears open for things like this. She gives examples of 2 different people where one guy was like one of the best NFL quarterbacks of all time. He had very conservative parents, wasn't allowed to swear. He called his dad when he was in college playing football. He wanted to come home because he wasn't doing well, and his dad said, well, if you leave, you're not coming back here because, you know, I didn't raise a quitter. And it gives an example of an English comedian and how she was allowed to swear in her house. She was allowed to leave school at 16. Didn't really have a lot of rules, but they both excelled in their field and became highly successful. But then she dials into it more, and it's a mixture of a lot of love and support but high expectations. So the NFL boy, when he was a wee boy and he was in primary school, he didn't want to go. He got scared, he got upset. His mum actually went and sat in his class for 2 months with him just so that he would feel settled. And also he was rubbish at baseball, so his dad went to the park with him every day until he got better. So even though they had kind of conservative values, it shows you the setup was still the same without the details. There was a lot of love and a lot of high expectations. Similarly, the comedian girl, she had bad cerebral palsy and she had to go to physio that she didn't want to do, but her dad made her go, and he said it caused fights, loads of tantrums, loads of holes in doors, but it did make her go whether she wanted to or not. And they also didn't have a TV in their house. You could go to their gran's and watch TV if they wanted, but so there was still actually a lot of structure, and she dialed it down to the same thing. A lot of love but high expectations. So that was a kind of prevailing theme when it came to parenthood, and I thought that was really, really interesting. The last part that I want to go into and that I thought was really profound was the idea of learned helplessness. So there was a study done on dogs, and basically dogs were getting an electric shock, and the ones that could stop it by pressing a button eventually went on to, in further experiments, if there was something bad going on, they would seek a way out of it and they would escape. Dogs that were given an electric shock and couldn't affect it, they were on to a further experiment where again they were getting shocked. They didn't try and find a way out, they just lay down and accepted it. They had learned that they were helpless. And Angela Duckworth had said that she was concerned that a lot of kids from poor backgrounds were basically developing learned helplessness, where they just thought there was no way they could better their situation, so why even try? why ever delay gratification, why ever work towards anything, because life is hard and you can't do anything to affect it. That's what they had learned, as opposed to kids from more affluent backgrounds who had bags of confidence and all the support in the world, and they had seen that their actions could directly affect their life and make things better. And she had said that it's very, very important from an early age to teach kids that they can problem solve, that they can work things out, that even when things are difficult it can be fun, but it is ultimately within their power to affect that and to make it better. And I thought that was simultaneously so sad that a lot of people are in the situation where they do develop learned helplessness and they do think they can't better themselves, but ultimately I found it so profound and so informative, in a way so positive, because if you teach people that they can affect things, that they can work their way through things and that they can make things better, then that is a belief and a quality that they will carry all through their lives. And again, that's something that I really intend to try and imbue and imbibe and build into my own children. So yeah, this has been a very brief synopsis of this book. It's very comprehensive when it comes to this subject, and I couldn't recommend it highly enough. My only critique, and it isn't really a critique, is that some of the examples she gives are quite lengthy, and it almost feels sometimes like she's kind of labouring the examples. It's a bit like Robert Cialdini's Influence book. The only thing I would say about that is, although it gets slightly slow sometimes, the fact that the examples are laboured, for want of a better word, are so extensive, it does really hammer home the point. So as much as it might get almost slightly monotonous sometimes, it serves its purpose, because you come away and no doubt there's no ambiguity, you understand the lesson she was trying to teach, you don't forget it. Like, I understand the principles in this book fully and I remember them and I can now apply them in my own life. So even though that's a slight critique, it's not really. Like, it gets almost slow sometimes with the examples, but they do what they're meant to, and I really can't recommend this book enough. So I think it's going to be 9 out of 10 for me in this book. Again, it's a critique that isn't really a critique. Sometimes it's almost a bit slow with the examples. They get a wee bit monotonous, but they actually do what they were meant to. So I can't really see any flaws in the book. It's extremely interesting. It's a subject that I have a deep interest in, and I hadn't really seen anyone else approach it this way. But I think there's a lot of books that just tell you to, or a lot of material out there that tells you to just grin and bear it, stiff upper lip, just get the job done, the kind of David Goggins type stuff. This takes a totally different approach. It's a scientific approach, it's a nuanced approach, and it is extremely informative, so can't recommend it enough. And that is us. Thanks for watching, guys. I will link the book in the description as usual. Let me know what you think, let me know if you've read it, let me know what you think I should review next. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.